Imagine this. It's August 24th, 2001. You're on a brand new, super sophisticated airliner, heading on vacation with over 300 other people. And then, the impossible happens. The plane runs completely out of fuel over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. So, how on earth did this happen? And more importantly, how did it not end in total disaster? Let's get into the incredible story of Air Transat Flight 236.
This right here. This is the call from the cockpit that just sends a chill down your spine. We are gliding now. Think about that. That's a message you never, ever want to hear, especially not from a state-of-the-art Airbus A330. The pilots weren't just in trouble. They were facing a situation that was pretty much unheard of.
And this number, this is what it was all about. 306 people. Passengers and crew, you've got families, honeymooners, all on a red-eye flight from Toronto to Lisbon, and suddenly they're all trapped in a powerless jet thousands of feet above a very dark, very empty ocean. The stakes could not have been higher.
So the big question on everyone's mind was, how? How does a modern computerized jet just run out of fuel? It makes no sense, right? This plane, with all its backup systems and sensors, had turned into nothing more than a giant 200-ton glider. And the mystery of how it got that way was just getting started.
The flight started out completely normal, like boringly normal. Passengers were settling in for the long trip, probably excited about their vacations in Portugal. For the first 5 hours, everything was perfect. But then, a series of really strange warnings started popping up on the flight deck, and that was the beginning of everything starting to go wrong.
So to really understand what happened in the air, we actually have to go back in time, 5 days before the flight even left the ground. See, the root cause wasn't some sudden failure over the ocean. It was a small, almost insignificant-seeming mistake made in a maintenance hangar.
And here it is, the chain of events that set everything in motion. It all started with a routine engine replacement. But the new engine from Rolls-Royce arrived missing a critical hydraulic pump. So the mechanics had to improvise, and they decided to use parts from an older engine. The problem? Well, the parts didn't fit perfectly. A hydraulic line and a fuel line were now just millimeters apart, and with every minute the engine ran, they were vibrating and rubbing against each other. A ticking time bomb was officially set.
And here's where the human element really kicks in. The lead mechanic, he actually noticed this. He raised concerns about using the mismatched parts, but he was basically overruled. He was told that waiting for the correct part would cost too much and cause too many delays. So a decision that was all about time and money had just armed that bomb on engine number 2.
All right, let's jump back into the cockpit mid-flight. All of a sudden, the pilots are getting hit with these really confusing warnings. First, it's a weird oil reading. The temperature is low, but the pressure is high. Now, that just doesn't make any logical sense. So their first thought, it's got to be a computer glitch. Happens all the time.
So you've got this disconnect, right? The plane is practically screaming that something is seriously wrong. But the warnings it's giving are so bizarre, so contradictory, that the pilots start to lose faith in their own instruments. They're convinced it has to be a faulty sensor, some kind of bug in the software. And that distrust was about to have some pretty devastating consequences.
Then came the next alarm, a fuel imbalance. The computer said the right-wing tank had way less fuel than the left. So the pilots did exactly what the checklist told them to do for a fuel imbalance. They made a fateful decision. They opened something called the cross-feed valve. Its job is to balance the fuel load. But here's the thing, they didn't have an imbalance, they had a leak. They were now taking all the good fuel from the left engine's tank and pumping it directly overboard through the leak in the right engine.
And from there, everything just unraveled with terrifying speed. At 6:13 a.m., the right engine, the one with the leak, finally starved and flamed out. Just 13 minutes later, after all its fuel had been pumped away, the left engine went quiet too. Silence. They were now completely powerless.
The new reality was just stark. They were gliding. Captain Robert Piget and his first officer, Dirk de Jager, were now faced with a nearly impossible task. They had to fly a 200-ton glider with 306 people inside to a tiny little speck of an island in the middle of the Atlantic called the Azores.
From their altitude up over 30,000 feet, they figured they had about 15 minutes. 15 minutes to glide over 100 kilometers, find a runway they couldn't see, and land, all without any engine power. If they got the math wrong, the only other option was ditching in the ocean, and survival rates for that are not good.
But they had one tiny little ace up their sleeve. This thing. It's called the ram air turbine, or RAT for short.
It's basically a small propeller that drops out of the plane and spins like a pinwheel in the airflow. It doesn't give you engine power, but it generates just enough electricity and hydraulic pressure to let the pilots actually move the controls. The plane was a glider, but thanks to the rat, it was a controllable glider.
So as they're getting close to the runway on the island, they realize they have yet another problem. They're too high and they're going way too fast. Without engines, you can't just use reverse thrust to slow down. So Captain Pache had to improvise. He put this massive Airbus into a full 360-degree turn and then a series of sharp S-curves just to try and bleed off all that extra speed and altitude. It was an absolutely incredible display of airmanship.
When they finally hit the runway, they were traveling at nearly 200 knots. That's over 230 miles per hour. I mean, that is dangerously fast for a landing, way faster than you'd ever want to be going. They had one shot. This had to work.
The landing was so hard, the force was so immense, that 8 of the plane's main tires just burst on impact. But the plane, it stayed on the runway. It screeched to a halt, and against all odds, everyone was safe. They had just pulled off the longest powerless glide in commercial aviation history.
So what happens next? Well, in the aftermath, the story becomes this complicated mix of incredible heroism and, well, critical human error. The investigation looked at every single decision, from the mistake in the maintenance hangar to the choices made in the cockpit, and what emerged was a very complex and pretty controversial legacy.
You see, this wasn't about one single thing going wrong. It was a cascade, a perfect storm of what-ifs. A maintenance error starts to leak. Confusing warnings lead to a bad call in the cockpit. A standard procedure actually makes the problem 100 times worse. But then you have a stroke of incredible luck. Air traffic control had changed their route earlier, which just happened to put them close enough to the Azores to make it. And then, of course, you have extraordinary skill that saved the day.
And the fallout from this was huge. It affected the entire industry. Air Transat was fined. Airbus actually updated its computers and its emergency checklist to be much clearer about fuel leaks. Rolls-Royce sent out new warnings about using the wrong parts. And the pilots? Well, they were given awards for their incredible flying, but their decision to open that crossfeed valve was also heavily scrutinized. And that really brings us to the heart of it, right? The central question of this whole event. How do you weigh the mistakes that created the crisis in the first place against the phenomenal skill that saved everyone in the end? It's something that the passengers and the aviation world have been wrestling with ever since.
I think this quote from one of the passengers really says it all. It just perfectly captures the complicated truth of Flight 236. A chain of human errors put 306 lives at risk, but in those final, terrifying minutes, it was an unbelievable act of human skill that brought every single one of them home.